In the first part of the lecture, we heard the story of one of the most notorious figures in the narco-trafficking enterprise, El Chapo. One of the reasons why his story is so relevant for this course in particular is because of connections across borders that it demonstrates. While based in Mexico, it's clear that Guzman's actions and the Sinaloa cartel have very real impacts beyond that country, and his activities in Mexico are driven in large part by forces coming from outside that country. The most fundamental of these factors is the demand for illegal drugs. Perhaps for obvious reasons, it's not particularly easy to obtain statistics on the trade in illegal drugs that are definitive and 100% accurate. But the studies that have been done would seem to suggest that the retail value of the annual global drug trade is pretty consistently more than $300 billion. Revenues in the Americas are typically thought to account for half that total, around $150 billion, and not surprisingly, North America and the United States in particular account for the dominant share of that figure. In simple terms, there is huge demand in North America, especially the United States, for illicit drugs. Mind you, this is not a recent phenomenon by any means, though the scale of illicit trade is certainly impressive in more recent decades. In the mid-19th century, various local governments in the United States were already passing restrictive laws that prohibited various forms of drugs. Of course, America even passed the 18th Amendment to its Constitution in 1919 that prohibited the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol. Prohibition, as it was called, would remain in effect until the 1930s. While there are early examples of attempts to similarly control narcotics, it would take until the 1970s before government attention really began to focus on the implications of narcotics and their wider impacts on American society. Narcotic addiction among soldiers in the Vietnam War was laid out in a report that was released by two congressmen in 1971. The report suggested that 10 to 15% of service personnel were addicted to heroin and that marijuana use was rampant. That summer, President Richard Nixon seized on the issue and made it clear that he intended to develop some sort of comprehensive approach to the problem. From the White House, he announced, "America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive, dealing with the problems of sources of supply, as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad, wherever they are in the world." Drug use amongst Vietnam soldiers had brought the issue to the forefront, but Nixon clearly intended that this offensive would address illegal drug use at home, throughout America, as he would put it. To carry out this offensive against drugs, Nixon established the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, as it's commonly known, in July 1973. The idea here was to create a single federal agency that would both enforce federal drug laws and coordinate the government's drug control activities. Some 600 special agents were merged together from various existing services. 40 years later, the DEA has a $3 billion annual budget and more than 10,000 employees. In the months following Nixon's declaration of war against drugs, there were some 6,000 drug arrests, so it certainly appeared as though the government was taking action, especially when you consider the creation of the DEA, too. But there really was no dramatic increase in the number of people jailed for about a decade. Later presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, essentially carried on with the same policies as Nixon. Then, in the 1980s, things changed dramatically. Shortly after taking office, President Ronald Reagan returned to the war metaphors Nixon had coined when delivering a speech on the topic of drug abuse. The president declared, "We're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up a battle flag." While part of this new Reagan offensive would focus on prevention, an issue especially taken up by First Lady Nancy Reagan, some of the more controversial aspects of Reagan's effort included new, mandatory prison sentences. Public attention was especially focused on cocaine cocaine use in the summer of 1986, when basketball star athlete Len Bias died as a consequence of a cocaine overdose. Bias had been a promising young man who had been selected by the Boston Celtics as the second overall pick in the NBA draft, just 2 days before his death. Within a few short months, Congress had passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. The law provided an additional $1.7 billion to pay for Reagan's new offensive in the drug war. More significantly, the law established 29 new mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. This was a tremendous change in the application of laws to the drug problem. To that point in time, there were only 55 minimum sentences in the entire legal system in the U.S. This would have important consequences, particularly because the number of arrests for all crimes increased in the 1980s by 28%, but the number of arrests for drug offenses actually rose by 126%. In the following decade, the 1990s, the increasing number of drug offenses resulted in 27% of the total growth among black inmates, 7% among Hispanic inmates, and 15% among white inmates. By 2008, 1.5 million Americans were being arrested for drug offenses, leading to jail for 500,000. Just under 1% of the total American population was in prison. We'll actually talk more about issues related to crime, violence, and prisons later in the course. For now, it's important just to appreciate the critical impact the war on drugs had on the American justice system. Another important point to make here is that the war on drugs was waged disproportionately against African Americans. When the new minimum sentences were introduced in 1986, the law also distinguished between different forms of cocaine. Possession of 500 grams of powdered cocaine resulted in a minimum mandatory sentence of 5 years in federal prison. But the same sentence was given to those in possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine. Crack use resulted in a shorter, more intense high. Because less of the drug was used, it was cheaper and more cost-effective. So it became more popular in inner cities, where neighborhoods might more likely be predominantly African American. In effect, powdered cocaine became the white suburban drug of choice, and crack became the black drug. The Reagan administration even encouraged the DEA to especially emphasize the harmful effects of crack to strengthen public opinion behind the campaign against the drug. It became common to hear the terms crack whore and crack babies. Now, because much smaller quantities of crack could result in lengthier prison terms, you can see how this would impact the racial profile of prisons. This was then compounded by the racial inequalities inherent in the justice system itself. While African Americans are thought to make up 13% of regular drug users, they actually constitute 35% of drug arrests, 55% of drug convictions, and 74% of people sent to prison for drug crimes. To put it bluntly, if you are African American, you are much more likely to be arrested for drug crimes and then receive a much stiffer penalty or prison sentence. On the domestic front in the war on drugs, not much then changed with the later presidencies of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. In August 2010, President Obama did sign into law the Fair Sentencing Act, and it substantially reduced the disparity between sentences given out for crack and powdered cocaine. The very distinction that had resulted in so many more minorities being impacted by harsher minimum sentences. It's important to note that the war on drugs is waged not only at home in the United States, but also abroad. Even President Nixon's early efforts to address the issue included some attempts to increase border control along the U.S.-Mexico border, in that instance to stem the flow of marijuana. When traffic almost came to a standstill as a result of Nixon's crackdown, the border states protested, and the effort was short-lived. The Merida Initiative is a more recent example of how the drug war can shape foreign policy. In June 2008, the United States began this initiative in cooperation with Mexico and other Central American countries. $1.4 billion was earmarked for Mexico alone to provide that government with military and law enforcement training, equipment, and and technical advice to strengthen the Mexican justice system. I'll talk more about this in later parts of the lecture. For now, let's just recognize that the war on drugs goes well beyond American borders. The American war on drugs remains a contentious issue across the United States, and there is considerable variation in views and attitudes in various parts of the country. Polls have indicated that as much as 75% of Americans think the war on drugs is failing as public policy. The racial inequalities embedded within it no doubt contribute to these views. The criminal records that result from drug crimes also have the potential to create a permanent underclass of people who have tremendous difficulty securing employment and becoming productive, engaged citizens. This has led, in some instances, to discussions of legalization. One Harvard professor has estimated that the annual savings on enforcement and prison costs that would come with the legalization of drugs would amount to roughly $41.3 billion. But then, opponents of legalization worry over the potential social implications of increased drug use that might come with legalization. This hasn't stopped some states from moving in that direction. Colorado and Washington have now legalized the recreational use of marijuana, for example. That's all for this part of the lecture. We'll turn to the continental implications of the war on drugs in the final parts of the lecture. Bye for now.